Ethics is a philosophical discipline that studies how we should live and how we should act. And these two categories encompass really a broad range of questions. On the one hand, because ethics studies how we should act, it will be concerned with what is the right thing to do in specific ethical situations or in ethical dilemmas. Is it ever acceptable to tell a lie? What should we think about controversial ethical issues like abortion and the death penalty? But because ethics is also broader, it also encompasses not just how you should act in certain situations, but it encompasses your life as a whole and really what the purpose of your life is. It's also going to ask the question, what are the most important things in life? What are the most important things that a human being should pursue? And what should a human life be oriented toward if it is a human life that is lived properly? So this is the domain of ethics. And the purpose of this video is going to be to give an introduction to the philosophical study of ethics by looking at 4 different questions that philosophers tend to ask about ethics. And each of these questions is going to give us insight into a different aspect of ethical thinking and a different aspect of what it means to think about how to live well and how to act well. So what are these 4 questions? So here are the 4 questions I have in mind, which I'll go through in this video. First, from an ethical point of view, one question we should ask is, what action will do the most good? What will produce the best consequences? Right, a very natural and common question to ask yourself when you're faced with a tough ethical choice or you're deciding what you should do in a particular circumstance is, well, what will do the most good? What will have the best outcome, the best effect? What will increase the well-being of everyone involved? And this is a crucial ethical question. The second question we'll think about is a different way of looking at ethics. Instead of thinking about the consequences or the effect or the outcome of our actions, we might ask the following question. Is my action universalizable? Now, what does that mean? That's sort of a fancy philosophical way of just asking, could everyone perform the action I'm about to perform? So for instance, imagine you're thinking about, well, would it be acceptable to tell a lie in this instance? If you're thinking in terms of the first question, you might just say, well, should I tell a lie just depends on, will it produce happiness? Will it bring about a good outcome? But in terms of the second question, you might say, well, maybe the outcome is secondary. Maybe I should instead think, well, were I to tell a lie in this situation, would I be making an exception of myself? Would I be acting in a way that it wouldn't be okay for everyone in society to act? And if I am acting in that way, what makes me special? Why am I making an exception of myself? And that cluster of questions about universalizability, about performing actions that everyone can perform, is a second important question in the realm of ethics. A third question takes a more holistic perspective and focuses not so much on what is the right or wrong action in the realm of ethics, but it takes a broader view of our life as a whole. And this question is the following. What kind of character am I developing through my actions? What kind of person am I becoming through my actions? We might think it's not just important that we do the right thing, that we face ethical dilemmas and challenging ethical scenarios in a way that produces the best consequences or in a way that upholds our integrity by acting in a way everyone can act. We might also think it matters the way I'm about to act, how will that affect the person I'm becoming, the character I'm building, and hopefully the virtues I'm trying to inculcate in myself. The third question really does pertain to how do we develop ourselves as human beings? And this brings me to the fourth and final question we're going to look at. Why do the right thing at all? Why care about ethics? The first 3 questions were all certainly different from one another, right? They emphasize different aspects of ethical action. They might focus on character as opposed to discrete individual things that we do. But what unites 1 through 3 is that they all take seriously this idea of living an ethical life. They take seriously the idea that we should be concerned with doing what is right and good and just. But a broader question we can ask at an even higher level is, why should we care about any of that? If we start to think about ethics, we can immediately notice that in many cases, not lying, not stealing, not cheating other people, this can all come at a cost to ourselves. And if doing the right thing isn't going to benefit me, and if there are cases I could get away with doing the wrong thing, then why should I care about ethics and morals in the first place? What is in it for me? Why should I be the sort of person who's committed to doing the right thing? These are the 4 questions we're going to look at in this video, and the hope is that they will give us further insight into what it means to think philosophically about ethics and morality. Now, in order to further understand these 4 questions, we're going to consider one particular case that comes from our textbook. And this is the impaired driver case. So I'm first going to read through the case and give you a general sense of the situation. So here's the case. You've stayed about an hour longer than you intended to at a very pleasant party with your old college friends. While you were getting your law degree and starting practice, your roommate Marty made it big on Wall Street. He hosted the party in his huge Riverside Drive apartment. All the old college ties were there. Great memories, beer, booze, marijuana. Hadn't seen that in a while. Good stuff, too. Realizing you're late, you race to the parking garage, elevator to the 3rd floor, hop in your SUV, and tear around to the turn toward the exit. Smash! Car parked in just the wrong place. You hit it dead center. You back up, get out, note that there's extensive damage to the other car. Both doors on the driver's side badly dented, but none to yours. What should you do? You know damn well what to do. There's clearly damage, lots of it, so you have to take out your cell phone, call the police, and wait there till they come. Watching you propping yourself up against the SUV, they'll insist on the inconvenience of a breathalyzer test. When they get the results of that, they'll give you a chauffeured ride to the precinct station and insist further on a urine test. When they get the results of that, you may get to know the folks in the precinct very well before you see the sky again. You may very well, probably will, lose your license to operate a motor vehicle. The fines will be substantial, you may lose your SUV, you may even go to jail. The damage to your reputation and to your position in your law practice will probably be irreparable. Depending on the state, they may yank your license to practice law. That's a lot to think about. Meanwhile, you're the only occupant of this parking garage at this hour. You could just drive back to Connecticut and not say anything to anyone. So the first thing to say about this case is there are a number of different facets of it that we might take into account when we're trying to decide what should we do in this situation. First, there are a number of different stakeholders. Depending on what you do, it might have drastic ramifications for your life, your professional life, and maybe the income that could be supporting this person's family. On the other hand, the person whose car you have damaged, they also have a stake in this situation, given that, well, if you drive off, there'll be no one to pay for the damages. We might even think society as a whole has a stake in this matter, given that, of course, driving off would be against the law. Furthermore, if we're presuming that your time at the party has left you in an impaired state, then, of course, you getting back on the road, leaving the scene, and going to Connecticut could put other people in serious danger as well. And of course, the very fact that it's brought up that there's an option to drive back to Connecticut brings up the following question: should you care about anything else other than your own personal benefit? Even if you think it is wrong in actuality to leave the scene of the accident and to get back on the road, even if you think that's wrong, why, again, should we care about what is morally right? Why should we care about doing the right thing? So there are a number of different facets to this case, and the reason it's helpful is because, once again, it's going to help us to discuss the 4 ethical questions that I outlined previously. And that is to say, what action will do the most good? Is my action universalizable? What kind of character am I developing? And why should I do the right thing? So to begin, let's start with question 1. When we're thinking ethically, we might ask ourselves, what action will do the most good? What will produce the best consequences? And again, I do think this is a natural way of thinking about the decisions we make. Because we say, look, each action we perform has some purpose, it has some end, it has some outcome. And so if the reason we perform an action is for the outcome, then I guess the actions we should perform are those with the best outcomes. Now, of course, this is just the beginning of the questions we need to ask, because even if we agree that what determines whether an action is right or wrong is whether it has the best outcome, we also need to ask, well, how do we know what the best outcome is? And here we can turn to really the classical statement of this approach to morality, which is found in an ethical theory known as utilitarianism or consequentialism. Right? And so the author of our textbook, Lisa Newton, explains that in classical utilitarianism, as set forth by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, the only consequences that matter are happiness and unhappiness, pleasure and pain for everyone affected by the act. So if we take what is known as the consequentialist view of ethics, which holds that all that matters is the consequences of our actions, or the utilitarian view, which holds that when we judge an action, we're judging its utility or its effect on overall happiness. What we're asking is, how can we act in such a way as to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of individuals? And again, the classic statement of this is found in the English philosopher John Stuart Mill. And in his book, Utilitarianism, he explains the theory in the following way, according to what he calls the greatest happiness principle. Mill tells us that the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And all of this sounds great. Actions are to produce outcomes. And how do we know if an outcome is good? Well, what makes our lives go well? Happiness. What makes our lives go poorly? The lack of happiness or sadness. So it seems to just follow that when we're deciding what to do, we should ask, well, what will make everyone the happiest who's involved in the situation? Okay, so let's apply this to the present case, right? And let's ask ourselves in the impaired driver scenario, what would a consequentialist do? If you're a consequentialist, if what you're saying is the decision we make is the one that will produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of individuals, then how should we act in this situation? Well, here's what Newton says. She says, measuring pleasure and pain for all parties, including your family, the owner of the car, even the world at large, it looks like your best course is to take off for Connecticut without doing anything at all. Drive slowly so you don't get stopped. After all, the pain felt by the car owner upon finding his damaged car is nothing compared to the pain that you and your family would feel if you lost your ability to earn a living, let alone if you went to jail. Besides, his insurance would probably cover the whole bill. So when Newton looks at this case from a purely consequentialist perspective, purely from the perspective of what action will do the most good, she argues that the morally correct action from that point of view would be to drive off, go back to Connecticut, and say nothing. By doing that, you retain your job and the income that your family relies upon. And whatever pain the car owner would feel if you simply drove off is probably going to be outweighed by the pain that your family would feel by all of a sudden not being able to support themselves with a stable income. So if we just look at it from that point of view, it does seem that maybe driving back to Connecticut might produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number, even though it is illegal and even if it maybe feels wrong. Now, I think, interestingly, one aspect that Newton didn't mention is that, of course, getting back on the road would put you in risk of seriously harming other people insofar as you're driving in an impaired state. So I think one question we can actually ask here about Newton's discussion of this case is, from a utilitarian, from a consequentialist point of view, does she really take into account all the various factors that could influence the happiness of everyone who has a stake in your decision? But even putting that aside, because it will always be difficult, I think, to predict the future and to know how our actions will affect the happiness of others when we're just sort of making a prediction based on probabilities of what could happen. So let's put that aside for the moment and let's think about a second question as well. Let's say we agree with Newton that if we're purely thinking like consequentialists, purely thinking like utilitarians, let's say we agree that the right thing to do is to drive away. Well, should this make us think about the consequentialist perspective on morality? That is, we might ask ourselves, is consequentialism right about what it means to act ethically? Because here it seems to recommend that we act in a deceptive way, that we break the law, that we act perhaps unjustly toward the owner of the car who we hit. How can that be the morally right thing to do? Now, these questions actually constitute a very common criticism of utilitarianism, and to understand this criticism of the consequentialist moral theory, I want to look at a second case. I'm going to call this case arresting the innocent. So imagine you are a district attorney in a town where a tragic murder of a young child has occurred. You have no leads on who committed the crime, but suspect the person has already left town and that you will not be able to catch the culprit. Emotions are running high and many people are extremely angry. Suppose you know that the citizens will soon riot unless someone is arrested for the crime, and that if the riots occur, many people will be harmed and killed. You know that you could prevent the riots by arresting and charging one innocent person with the crime. Let's say this person is not particularly well liked by the other people in the town, and many people already suspect that he is guilty. So if you punish this person, nobody will find out that you punished an innocent person. Should you punish this innocent individual with the crime? So the situation is, you know that if you don't arrest and charge someone with this crime quick, there will be riots that could be deadly, that could cause property damage, that could cause a lot of pain and suffering. You start to think purely from a consequentialist point of view, purely in terms of what is the outcome, how can I create the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people? And when you do that, you might be led to the conclusion that, well, look, maybe I should just get the least popular person in town, who's, although completely innocent, nobody's going to ask any questions, and just charge them with the crime. Sure, maybe they didn't actually do it, but it will stop the riots, and it will create the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people in town by ensuring the safety and stability of all the citizens. Now, from a consequentialist point of view, that might seem great, right? You've reduced suffering, you've increased happiness. But on the other hand, we might think about it just solely from the perspective of the innocent individual who just got arrested. After all, we seem to have this bedrock moral intuition that the guilty and only the guilty should be arrested and charged and punished for crimes. And that if you're innocent, no matter what benefit could accrue to society from you being arrested and punished, it is simply unjust. It is a violation of your individual rights to be arrested. So let's apply this to the consequentialist theory more generally. This just is a sort of structural issue with the theory. If all that matters is doing what is best for the majority, there's always going to be cases in which a single individual or minority of individuals can be treated poorly in order to benefit a greater amount of other people. And let's apply this back to the impaired driver case. We might say, look, let's accept the claim that the greatest happiness will be produced if you drive away from the accident. Maybe that's false, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that it's true. Isn't it also extremely unjust to leave the accident and leave the person who owns the other car simply hanging there with no one there to pay for the damages? Isn't that a violation of their individual rights? And this is a common criticism of this approach to morality, that while we are attempting to pursue what is best for the greatest number, there's always going to be some injustices to individuals that seem to be left in our wake. At this point, you might be uncomfortable with the consequentialist approach to morality. You might say, look, there are certain laws, there are certain rules that are in place that are the bedrock of society and that we need to follow. You need to follow the law. If you cause damage, you need to take responsibility for it. These are just fundamental sort of rules or laws that we need to follow and can't just be sacrificed when it will bring harm to us or when it would be really inconvenient if we had to follow the rule. Now, if you're thinking along those lines, then maybe the second question about ethics is one that you think will be more essential and will be more appealing to you. What is this question? The question is my action universalizable? Which, remember, we just said is a way of asking, could everybody perform this action? And Newton begins to explain this approach in the following way. She says, yes, but think of it this way. The law is there for a purpose. What you are supposed to do as a citizen right now is call the police. That's your duty. You've enjoyed all the benefits of citizenship. Now it's time to honor your part of the bargain. And that sort of reasoning, the thinking that there are certain rules that we all need to follow and that we all need to do our part in following unconditionally, underlies a different approach to morality called a deontological approach to morality, which comes from the Greek word for duty. Now, the classic representative of the deontological approach to morality was a philosopher named Immanuel Kant. And to sum it up in one sentence, he said that morality really can be boiled down to what he called the categorical imperative. And he explained the categorical imperative in a number of ways, but here is one of the most famous explanations of it. Kant says, act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Now again, that's some fancy philosophical language, but what does it mean? When you break it down, its meaning is actually relatively straightforward. You should only act in ways, you should only make decisions in ways that you would be comfortable and that you would think that everybody could act. The idea is that the way you live your life, the decisions you make, and the actions you take should not just be actions that are good for you, should not just be actions that are designed to bring you what you want, but should be actions that you would be comfortable with anybody taking. The way he sort of puts it here is that what you should do is imagine that the way you are about to act is about to become a law or a moral rule that everybody is going to follow. And then ask yourself, could my way of acting really be universal in that sense? Could everybody act in this fashion? Now, Newton thinks that once we look at the situation from this perspective, she thinks we will see that the right thing to do is to not leave the scene of the accident, to take responsibility for the damage we have caused and call the police. Right? And here is the way that she explains it. What if everyone who got in an accident just took off? Would the world be a better place? Could you approve of a law that said when you find you've caused damage to life or limb or property, if it isn't convenient to stay around, just take off? If you can't, and you probably can't, then you have no right to make an exception of yourself in this case. So to a certain extent, the categorical imperative coming from Kant requires us to put ourselves in the shoes of others and really in the shoes of someone making rules and laws for all of society. And to be honest with yourself. Would you be comfortable living in a society where anyone at any time, whenever it would be inconvenient for them to take responsibility for what they've done, simply decided not to take responsibility? Not only would this be an undesirable society to live in, maybe not only would it be a society which lacked integrity, but we could quickly see how things would fall apart. It would be difficult to trust our fellow citizens if they knew they would never take responsibility for what they've done, and it simply isn't a rule or law that could govern a stable and peaceful social arrangement. So this is the idea behind the deontological approach and behind Kant's categorical imperative. And I think there are two important questions that we should really ask ourselves here at this point. The first question is, why should we care if our actions are universalizable? Right? I mean, it's common to say that you shouldn't act in a way that you wouldn't be comfortable with others acting, but why? What's actually wrong with it? And I think in order to gain some insight into this question, it can be helpful to use a concrete example. So let's say you're doing a project for school, and let's say it's a group project. You've all probably been in a scenario like this before at some point in your academic career, and we all know the sort of anxiety and the hesitation and skepticism about group projects. And why does that exist? Well, it exists for the following reason. Because we know there's a possibility of someone acting as a free rider. We know there's a possibility of someone saying, look, I could do the work I'm supposed to do, I could take my part, and I could do my part to ensure the success of this project, but I know everyone else is motivated to get a good grade, so if I don't do my part, they'll just pick up the slack, and I can get an A without doing anything. Right? We're all aware of this phenomena. And the thing to think about here is, well, what is actually wrong with what this person has done? If you were that person's partner in a group project, how would you explain to them, not just from your personal annoyance, but from a moral point of view, why they are wrong to act the way they are acting? And I think the best way to put it would be this. What makes them so special that they think they are allowed to act in that fashion? Notice that if everyone took this approach, if everyone said, I'm going to do nothing relying on the other group members, the project would immediately fall apart. Which means the person who's not doing their part in a group project is really a parasite on everyone else. They seem to assume that they get special privileges to get an A without doing anything, that they're presuming the other people don't have those privileges. Because if other people did act in this way, if they took the privileges this person was taking for themselves, their own initial goal, their own initial plan would not be possible. The only way to get an A on the project without doing anything is for other people to pick up your slack. And I think what this shows is that the person who doesn't act in a way that's universalizable violates our intuitions about the fundamental equality of people. When I ask the question, what makes you so special? I'm asking the question, what makes you different? What gives you special rights? And if we think that all people are moral equals and no one should be more morally important than anyone else, then it's wrong of you to take rights for yourself that in principle could not be had by others. I think that is one reason why Kant's idea behind the categorical imperative really has a strong intuitive pull. There's a second important question to think about here as well. Let's say we accept that the categorical imperative is a true guiding principle for ethics. We might also ask the question, has Newton applied it correctly in this case? Right, Newton says that leaving the accident would not be a universalizable action. And remember, the idea behind universalizability is we say, look, if everyone were motivated in this way, if this is the purpose everyone was trying to achieve, would that be possible? Could we all live in a society like that? And notice how she describes the fundamental motivation behind the action. When you find you've caused damage to life or limb or property, if it isn't convenient to stay around, then just take off. She's supposing that the fundamental motivation here is just to avoid inconvenience. And certainly, if we imagine a society where anyone who found that it was inconvenient to follow the law simply broke the law, then society would break down very quickly. That certainly would not be universalizable. But I wonder whether there's a different way in which we could describe the situation. Maybe the motivation behind the action isn't quite so clear-cut. Instead, we might say something like this. Whenever I need to break the law or evade responsibility for harm caused in order to avoid serious hardship for my family, then it's acceptable to do so. Now, is that a universalizable action or principle? It might be. Cases like that may not be all that common, they may be relatively rare, and we might be able to imagine a society or a stable social arrangement where the vast majority of the time people follow the law, but in extreme and very unique circumstances where breaking the law was necessary to prevent great hardship to one's family, then one said, well, it's acceptable to break the law. It might be possible we could live in a society coherently where everyone was able to follow that principle. The main point being here is that when we're thinking about whether an action is universalizable, we need to be careful, and we really need to think about how are we describing the action and how are we describing the motivation behind that action. Our discussion on the first two questions about ethics has really focused on the question of how to act well, or what is it that makes an action morally good or morally bad? Is the moral status of an action determined by its consequences, or is the moral status of an action determined by whether acting in that way would be possible for everyone, whether that action could serve as a stable rule that all people could follow? But the third question, I think, asks us to take a broader view of ethics. And instead of just asking the question, well, what makes an action right or wrong, let's ask a question about people. Let's ask a question about character and the relationship between how we act and who it is that we are becoming. So more specifically, the third question is, what kind of character am I developing through my actions? What kind of person am I becoming through the way that I act? And this approach to ethics is classically seen to be given by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who, as opposed to the teleological or deontological approaches we've seen thus far, had an ontological approach to ethics. It wasn't about your actions primarily, but it's about who you are as a person, your very being as a person, as Newton explains in our textbook. Now, in order to understand what Aristotle had to say about ethics, I want to look at a few passages from his most famous work on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about the process by which we develop a virtuous character. So a couple of main elements of his ethics. First, what he thought the purpose of ethics was to inculcate virtues, which are good traits of character, and avoid having vices, which are bad traits of character. And so the question is, well, how do we become virtuous? How do we fill our character with virtuous traits like honesty and justice and kindness and courage? Here's what Aristotle says. He says, virtues arise in us neither by nature nor contrary to nature. But nature gives us the capacity to acquire them, and completion comes through habituation. Virtues we acquire by first exercising them. So here's the question. You might ask, are human beings naturally good or naturally bad? And then Aristotle says, well, neither. We're not naturally good or naturally bad. It's not like human beings are inherently evil. We're also not inherently angels. What we are by nature are the kind of being and the kind of individual that can become good or can become bad through our actions. Whether you develop a good character or not is up to you. It depends on how you act. And how is it that we develop those traits? He says it's through habituation or through habit. And in this sense, for Aristotle, developing a virtue is very much like developing a skill, like learning how to shoot at basketball, or to carve something, or to paint, or any other sort of skill, or play a musical instrument. The way you get better at it is by practice, exercise, and developing good habits. So he tells us that we become just by doing just actions, temperate by doing temperate actions, courageous by doing courageous actions. If you want to be a courageous person, then get out there and face danger in the appropriate circumstances. And if we do that over and over again, we'll develop a sort of habit for virtue where we won't even need to think about how to act anymore. It'll just become a part of who we are. And one outcome of this is, he says, if you train yourself properly, if you build the right habits, you will actually take joy and pleasure in virtue. And in fact, Aristotle thinks if we come across someone who says they're virtuous, but doesn't like to do the morally right thing, doesn't take pleasure in doing what's morally right, then that's not really a virtuous individual. Aristotle tells us, for no one would call a person just if he did not enjoy acting justly, or generous if he did not enjoy generous actions. And the same goes for the other virtues. And we can see why this would be the case. If what ethics is about is building a certain sort of character, And what it's about is having a character where virtue and morality is just a part of who you are. Then acting in the right way, acting justly, acting kindly, acting generously, acting courageously, should not be some foreign demand on you. It shouldn't be an imposition on you that you find annoying. If it's really a part of your character and who you are, you should take joy in it. You should take pleasure in it. You should enjoy and take pleasure in doing the right thing. And all of that comes through habit. And you've probably had that experience in your life just with very simple things. There might be a food that you didn't like at first, but through time and habituation, you came to enjoy it. The same with other sorts of activities. And Aristotle sees ethics and development of a virtuous character in just the same way. Now, what does this have to tell us about the impaired driver case? Well, as Newton explains, when we apply this to concrete situations, we might say, well, maybe instead of trying to focus first on the action, focus first on your character. And ask the question, depending on how you act here, what sort of person are you likely to become, and what might other people think about what sort of person you are? So, Newton explains this in the following way. How would you explain it? How would you explain your action? How would you justify taking off like that when you were clearly in the wrong? If that scenario doesn't suggest an approach to the problem, put a reporter from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal sitting beside him in another chair. The reporter is going to describe the whole situation, including your reasons for acting as you did, in the newspaper tomorrow on the front page. What kind of person would you look like in that story? Is that the kind of person you want to be? If you're talking to this news reporter and you say, I did cause a lot of damage there in that parking garage, but I just left the scene of the accident because it would be inconvenient. I didn't want to suffer harm and hardship and lose my job, so I just cheated that person out of the repairing the damages to their car. How would people react when they read that? If you were really forced to confront the fact that is what you did, how would you feel about your action? And another thing to think about here is if our actions influence our character, the next time you are in a situation where your integrity is tested, will your character be stronger or weaker? Will it be easier for you to give in temptation, or will it be harder? And of course, the answer seems obvious. If you make a habit of giving into temptation, if you make a habit of sacrificing your integrity, it's just going to be easier in the future. And that simply is the road to developing a vicious and not virtuous character. All three of the ethical questions we have discussed thus far take a different approach to morality. But despite those differences which we have discussed, they're also united by something very fundamental. All three of those questions are questions which should challenge us. The first and second question about the consequentialist and deontological approaches to ethics both challenge us to put aside our self-interest and think about others. They each do this in a different way, one based on outcomes and effect and consequences for the happiness of our fellow citizens, the other focused on saying you can't just do what you want to do, you have to follow some stable rules and principles. But in either case, both of those approaches challenge us to put aside self-interest and think about a greater good. The third question about what sort of person am I becoming, and the question about character development challenges us really to be the best sort of person we can be. For Aristotle, he saw ethics and morality as necessary to human flourishing and human excellence. So all three of those questions, if we take them seriously, ask us to challenge ourselves to live better ethical and moral lives. But then there's the specter of a fourth question that's looming behind all this. And if challenging ourselves in this way, if engaging in sacrifice means putting aside some of what we want, putting aside some of our satisfaction, then we might ask, well, why do we have to do the ethically right thing? Why do I have to challenge myself? Why do I have to sacrifice for others? Why can't I just live life in a way where I do what I want to do that's best for me and get away with breaking moral rules where I can. And this is the fourth question I want to look at. Why do the right thing? Why care about ethics? Now, there's a lot that could be said about this question, but to conclude, I just want to look at one passage from a philosopher named David Hume, who was especially interested in this question. And Hume was talking about a phenomena that he called the sensible knave. So who's the sensible knave? It's just someone who follows the moral rules where they have to, but at every turn they break them when they think it will benefit them. So in the impaired driver case, the sensible knave would be someone who says, look, I'm going to leave this accident not because I think it's the morally right thing to do, but because I think I can get away with it. Because I don't think anything bad's going to happen to me if I do it. And if I stick around at the scene of the accident and call the police, there's going to be a whole lot of consequences for me. So the sensible knave knows what the morally right thing to do is, but they simply do not care. They break the moral rules whenever they think breaking those rules will benefit them. And what Hume does in this passage is that he gives some reasons famously for why it's not in our interest to act like a sensible knave. So here's what he says. He says, these sensible knaves will discover that they themselves are, in the end, the greatest dupes, and have sacrificed the invaluable enjoyment of a character, with themselves at least, for the acquisition of worthless toys and gewgaws. So what is he saying here? He says the sensible knave, by breaking the moral rules whenever they think it will benefit them, has given up something more valuable for what is less valuable. The sensible knave lies and cheats and steals to get money, let's say. What Hume is saying is that money that they gain through being ethically bad, through breaking the moral rules, is not worth what the sensible knave has to give up. Well, maybe that's true, but you might ask, well, what exactly is the sensible knave giving up? And Hume gives the following answer. He says, above all, the sensible knave is giving up peaceful reflection on one's own conduct. What comparison, I say, between these and the feverish, empty amusements of luxury and expense? The pleasures associated with having peaceful reflection on our conduct, he says, are really without price. There's a certain sort of priceless enjoyment to knowing that we have done the morally right thing. There's a certain enjoyment to knowing at the end of the day that we can look ourselves in the mirror and saying, I acted in the ethically correct fashion. And I think this is an important point because it puts an interesting twist on the way that we normally answer this question. Normally, if we ask ourselves, why do the right thing, we might say something like, well, if you did the right thing, your conscience would eat at you. It would be painful for you in the aftermath of this to know that you cheated someone for your own benefit. And I think that's true. I think that we do have a conscience, and when we do something wrong, it does make the aftermath of that decision unpleasant for us, and the guilt does get to us. But Hume is saying something more than that. He's saying not only is it painful to do the wrong thing, but it is enjoyable to do the right thing. There's a positive enjoyment associated with knowing you've done the right thing, and no matter how much money you can gain by doing the wrong thing, no matter how much power, no matter how much influence, no matter how much material benefit you can get from breaking the rules, it does not compare to the enjoyment you can get from knowing you've done the ethically and morally and virtuously correct action. Now, this is a strong claim. It does mean that there's no amount of material benefit that would be worth sacrificing the enjoyment of your character. But at the same time, if Hume is right, then ethics itself takes on a whole new character. Ethics is not just a set of arbitrary rules that we have to follow that are an inconvenience. It really is something that contributes to our happiness, our enjoyment, and our flourishing.